This is part 8 in the Craftsman Emerson Gen 4 Commercial Drill Press Rebuild series. If you haven't seen part 7, click the link at the top of the screen. The previous 7 videos have led us to this point. It's time to start the assembly of this drill press. Hello everyone, I'm Jeff and welcome to my shop. We got a lot to cover, so let's get to it. First thing we're going to do is lube up the base bores. So for this I use Super Lube. I like this stuff. It's clear and does a great job. It's a good synthetic lubricant. So I'm just going to apply some to all 3 of those bores where the column interacts with the base. And I'm going to put some on the base column lock screw. Since all this stuff, the base and all of its components are on the floor, they'll tend to rust depending on where you put your drill press. So lubricating this stuff really helps with it not rusting. So we'll just put the base on the floor. We started that lock screw. And there is no shoe for this base. Apparently they stopped doing or stopped using the shoe that goes inside that base with the Gen 4 models. So, and we're just going to insert the column. And here I'm going to raise the column up about 1/8 of an inch and then lock it down. That way the column's not resting on the floor. It's resting in that bottom bore, which is about 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch off of the floor. Next, we're just going to assemble the column collars. So this drill press comes with 2 of them. If you only have one, then I would recommend you place it where I'm going to put this first one, which is below the table. That way, if the table gets away from you, it won't fall all the way to the floor. And we'll just tighten it down. Then next we're going to lube all the bores inside the table itself. So you've got the bore that the lock goes in, and then the column bores. And then we'll go ahead and lube up the lock. So this is the threaded end or the nut, and that's got to go in first. You see that flat that's on there, that the nut has 2 flats, and one of those flats has to engage with the column. And then we've got, so this drill press had an extended lock screw, so it has a stop on it, and that's what I'm assembling here. But even if you have just the regular lock screw, all we're going to do is lube it up as well. And then the sleeve, which only has 1 flat on it, we'll put it on the screw and then lube it up. And again, that flat has to engage with the column. So when you place them inside the bore, you want to make sure the flats are facing towards where the column is going to be. And you might have to reach around to the back side to hold that other part, the nut itself, in place for the threads to engage, but you can also reach inside like I'm doing here and just apply some pressure to it so that you can get it to engage. And then we're just going to slide the table down on the column, line it up, and then lock it down. And so with the accessory table that this drill press had, this isn't the actual wrench that comes with that accessory table. It's a different wrench. And then we've got that piece that I fabricated, which is the lock pin. And the accessory wrench, or the wrench that was fabricated for this little table, was attached via a chain. So I'm just using some old metal rings, kind of like key rings, to attach it to the table. Kind of like this setup. And then we'll install the table. So you've got a lock screw for it and a washer. So we'll lube up that lock screw and then we'll go ahead and push it through the tilt table and insert it into the main table. Then we're going to line up the lock pin so that the table is lined up properly, and then we can tighten it down. So without that washer, that screw would go all the way to the column, and it's not supposed to. Next, we're going to install the other column collar. So if you have two, this is the second one you're going to install. And once we get the nuts tightened down a little bit, we're going to use a ruler and we're going to space this from the top of the column at about 5 3/4 of an inch. And that will ensure that the head can rest directly on that column collar and it'll be at its highest point. We'll just tighten it down. So next we're going to assemble the power panel. Here I'm just feeding the wire loom into the panel itself, and it's got a wire stress relief plastic clip that locks in place. And then we have another plastic clip that locks in there and holds all the wiring together. We've got 2 screws that go in it that are grounded, and that's where your grounds, one from the power cord and one from the electrical receptacle will go. And then we have the light socket, and it just gets attached with a small screw. Then we'll attach the 2 ground wires to those screws and tighten them down. We'll insert the electrical receptacle. It's got metal clips on the sides of it, so once you push it through, it will lock in place. and attach the ground for it. Tighten that down. And so we cut these wires to be able to separate these components. So we're going to need to strip them and put new terminals on them. So all three of the whites connect together. I'm just trimming it up a little bit. So you got one white coming from the power cord, one white coming from the light receptacle, and then one from the electrical receptacle. And I forgot to do it here, but I'll do it for the rest of the wiring, and I'll come back and do it with this one. But after I twist those together, I usually put some electrical tape around the shielded part of the wire to make sure that they all stay bunched together. Here I'm just putting that terminal on there. It's a butt terminal, and then we'll crimp it down. And that's good to go. So here I am coming back with the electrical tape, and we'll just put a little wrap of it there. So as you can see off to the side there, we have a couple of wires that are loose, and this is one of them. These are the 4 wires, or the 3 wires, that are going to connect to the switch panel. So they've got a specific place where they go depending on where they go on the switch, and I've got them all marked. I marked them when I pulled them off. So this is the right top red wire, and it's connecting to the black wire coming from the electrical receptacle. And then we're just going to put the electrical tape on it. And then we'll put a terminal on there. You could use wire nuts, but I don't like wire nuts. They tend to come off, and these are crimped on, so they ain't coming off unless you cut the wire. And then we have the black wire coming from the power. And it's going to connect to one of the black wires going to the switch panel. I don't remember which one, but they're for the left switch. And then we've got the right bottom red wire. So these are all going to be twisted together. And then connect it to the power. So that'll push power to both of the switches, and then the leads coming off of the switches back into the power panel that lead either to the light socket or the electrical receptacle. And another terminal. Okay, so all we need to do now is dress up our wires a little. Put them in that plastic clip that's sitting where my left thumb is. And then make sure that our 4 wires that are going to go to the switch panel aren't caught up under some of the other wires. So we're going to need as much of that length as we can get. So I have to fish out a couple of them here. And then we can lock down that plastic clip in the center and we're good to hook. So we'll set that aside. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to assemble the spindle pulley assembly. So I'm putting all new bearings in this drill press, and these are Nachi made in Japan bearings. They are 6205 double shielded. It's a 25 millimeter bore, 52 millimeter outside diameter, and they're 15 millimeters tall. And these are the exact same spindle pulley bearings that are used in all of the Craftsman 15.5-inch drill presses from the 100 series all the way up to the Gen 4 series. And that spreadsheet that's linked in the description of the video gives you all the measurements for all of this stuff and the bearing numbers and all that good information. Here I've just got a piece of, I think it's 1 inch or it might be 1 1/4 inch PVC pipe that I use to set these bearings. So we'll start them on the pulley insert. And once we've got them lined up, we can go ahead and tap the insert into the bearing. Once it's bottomed out, then we're going to have to use that PVC pipe. I should have grabbed a bigger mallet. And then we've got the sleeve that goes between the 2 bearings, or spacer. And these should go on pretty easy. Shouldn't require a whole lot of force. And then we'll switch back over to the PVC pipe. So that PVC pipe is resting on the inner race for the bearing. So it's not resting on the shield for the bearing, because that would damage the bearing. So whatever you use, make sure it's resting on the inner race for the bearing. So once we've got it down enough, we can slide the spacer in there and then put the second bearing on, which is actually the bottom bearing. And now all we need to do is get that bearing far enough down the insert that the channel for the retaining ring is exposed. So if you hit it too far down, don't sweat it. We'll go past the cutout for the retaining ring, that channel there. And once we've got that cutout exposed, we can take the retaining ring. Now, the lip on the inside of this retaining ring, one side of it is rounded and the other side is sharp. And we want the sharp side facing up as we've got it oriented here. We're just going to lock that in place. And then we can come back and move the bearings and the sleeve back towards that retaining ring and rest them against the retaining ring. And then we'll just spin those bearings to make sure they're spinning fine. And next, so you see there's a flat on the insert, and we're going to line that flat up inside the pulley. With the set screw hole. And that bearing should be resting on the pulley itself. And if all of that is good to go, you can lock it down. And that will complete the assembly of the spindle pulley assembly. Just make sure both those bearings spin freely. We're good to go. Last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and apply some of that super lube inside the splined area of the spindle pulley assembly. So next we're going to assemble the pinion hub and spring assembly. And it's got 3 screws that lock the pinion to the hub. So I'm lining those 3 screws up with, or the 3 holes in the pinion with the 3 holes in the hub. And I'm going to use a rag here so we don't mar up that hub since we painted it. And we're just going to tap that through until those holes line up. And I'm not going to use the brass side. I'll use the rubber side. And I'm just checking it to make sure that those holes line up. Then I'm going to use a small punch. This is like a 3/16 punch to make sure those holes are lined up for the screw. This is a 1/4 inch punch. I don't think it'll fit in there. So the 3/16 has some wiggle room, and it lets me just kind of push the pinion in place. Once we've got those holes lined up, we can go ahead and put the 3 screws in. So these screws should not penetrate to the inside of the pinion, but I've done a couple of drill presses where they do. So if they do, don't screw them down all the way. But if they don't, then go ahead and screw them down all the way. Next, we're just going to put on the feed handles and the feed knobs. So the reason that we don't want those screws to penetrate to the inside of the pinion is because we've got to insert the spring in there, and it will get hung up on those screws if they're penetrating. But once you've got the spring on the inside of the pinion, you can tighten those screws down. But we didn't have that problem with this drill press, so we're good to go. Once we've got all three of those handles and knobs on, then we're going to go ahead and slide that fiber washer on the pinion so we don't lose it. There we go. We can set that aside. So the next thing we're going to assemble is the spindle quill assembly. So I'm just placing my spindle inside a vise. And the first thing we're going to install is a retaining ring. This is a 5/8 retaining ring. The bore for the bearing that goes here is a 17 millimeter bore, but they still use a 5/8 retaining ring. So we'll just install it in that channel right there. And next, we will be installing a brand new Nachi double row ball bearing. This is a 5203 double shielded. It's got a 17 millimeter bore, 40 millimeter outside diameter, and a 17.5 millimeter height. And we're just going to use a piece of PVC pipe again, and we will just ride it down until it's resting on that retaining ring. And I think this is like a 3/4 or 1 inch piece of PVC pipe. And then we can apply the thrust collar. So the threads go towards the taper, so they're facing up as we have it oriented here. And again, we're lining up those marks that we made with the punch when we disassembled this. And then once we've got that seated properly, we can use a 1/4 inch punch to make sure it's all lined up. And then we'll insert the roll pin. We'll just get that roll pin started. And then we can change the orientation of the spindle in the vise. And then we'll use the punch to make sure that that roll pin is properly seated and it doesn't protrude from either side. Okay, so now we can take the quill and place it in the vise. So the end of the quill that has the outer channel for the snap ring is the bottom of the quill. So we have it upside down here. And then we can insert the spindle into the quill. And seat this bearing. So whatever you use, make sure it's rubber or plastic, because you do not want to damage the taper. Once we've got that seated, we've got that lock nut that goes in here. And once we've got it in there good, we can either use a screwdriver and a mallet to tighten it down, or this tool that I fabricated. And then we can flip the entire assembly over. Put it back in the vise. And on this end, the retaining ring actually retains the bearing, so it will go in last. And this is a real tight fit, so I'm just going to shoot some super slick stuff in here. So this new notchy bearing is a 6203 double shielded, and it has a 17 millimeter bore, 40 millimeter outside diameter, and is 12 millimeters tall. So we'll just use PVC pipe again and seat that bearing, and make sure you need to seat that bearing all the way until it stops. You can see that it's about 1/4 of an inch down inside the quill. And then we take the retaining ring, and you should be able to see that channel that the retaining ring rests in. And we just install the retaining ring. Make sure it loads completely into that channel. And then just make sure that the spindle turns freely, and we should be good. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to rotate this assembly again, place it back inside the vise, lock it down, and we're going to go ahead and put in that outer retaining clip, lock ring, whatever. This one was a 2-part, if you recall, so we'll just get one side started, hook it on there like that, and then start squeezing it together on the other end. And if you've got both sides inside the channel that it's riding in, then you should be able to just tap one of the sides with a mallet and it'll lock in place. Sorry, my fingers keep getting in the way. I'm trying to get it in camera so you can see it, but you can see how it's just barely missing, but tapping it with the mallet and bang, it locks right in. And the last thing I'll do is just grab a screwdriver and rotate this ring around so that the locking points are on the sides. Really doesn't matter, but it's how I like to do it. And that's going to wrap up this video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe. I think we've got 2, maybe 3 more videos to finish this drill press, and then on to the next project. As always, I appreciate the support, and I will see you next time.